Democrats treat black voters like inherited property, expecting loyalty without investment, demanding votes without delivery, acting like slave masters who believe we owe them our support simply because they're not the other guy. That ends now. Let me tell you about ownership. Real ownership requires investment, maintenance, responsibility, and accountability. But there's another kind of ownership, the kind rooted in entitlement, where someone believes they possess you simply because they always have. That's the relationship the Democratic Party has with Black America. Not earned partnership, not mutual benefit, ownership. And it's time we dealt with how we got here and how we break free. The story starts in a place most people don't want to talk about. Black Americans weren't always Democrats. In fact, for nearly a century after the Civil War, Black folks who could vote were overwhelmingly Republican. That was the party of Lincoln, the party that passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Republicans were the ones who sent federal troops to protect Black voters during Reconstruction. The Democratic Party, meanwhile, was the party of the Confederacy, the party of Jim Crow, the party of segregation and lynch mobs. But here's where it gets interesting from a strategic and psychological standpoint. The shift didn't happen because Democrats suddenly became morally superior. It happened because Republicans abandoned us first, and Democrats made a calculated political move to capture a voting bloc that had nowhere else to go. The transformation began during the Great Depression under Franklin Roosevelt. The New Deal programs provided economic relief that Black Americans desperately needed, even though those programs were often administered in discriminatory ways. But FDR was smart. He appointed some Black Americans to advisory positions. His wife, Eleanor, was publicly sympathetic to civil rights, and the economic benefits, however unequal, were real enough that Black voters started shifting Democratic. Then came the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson and the Democratic Party supported the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. Now let's be clear about the psychology and politics here. Johnson didn't do this out of the goodness of his heart. He was a calculating politician who understood that the future of the Democratic Party required capturing the Black vote, especially as Southern white Democrats were becoming unreliable. There's a famous quote attributed to Johnson where he allegedly said passing civil rights legislation would deliver the South to Republicans for a generation, but secure Black voters for Democrats. Whether he said those exact words or not, that's exactly what happened. The Southern strategy flipped white Southern voters to Republicans, and Black voters became the Democratic Party's most loyal constituency. And here's where the ownership mentality calcified. Democrats looked at voting patterns, saw that Black Americans were giving them 85 to 95% of our votes every election, and made a business decision. Why invest in a customer base that's already captured? Think about this from a pure strategic standpoint. If you own a business and you have a customer who buys from you no matter what, who never demands better service, who never threatens to go to a competitor, and who defends you even when you deliver subpar products, what's your incentive to improve? There isn't one. You focus your resources on winning over uncertain customers, swing voters, people who might go elsewhere. The loyal customer gets taken for granted because loyalty without leverage is just submission. That's the trap Black America fell into. We became so loyal to Democrats that we gave up our leverage, and the Democratic Party responded exactly how any rational political actor would. They stopped delivering. Let's talk numbers and outcomes, because this isn't about feelings, it's about results. Since the 1960s, Black Americans have voted Democratic at rates between 85 and 95% in presidential elections. That's unprecedented loyalty. No other demographic group comes close. Yet during this same period, what happened to Black economic outcomes relative to white Americans? The wealth gap widened. What happened to Black educational outcomes? Still lagging. What happened to Black incarceration rates? Exploded, often because of bipartisan tough-on-crime bills that Democrats championed. What happened to Black neighborhoods? Many remained economically devastated, even in cities run by Democrats for 50 consecutive years. This is the fundamental disconnect that Democrats don't want you to examine. They've received maximum political support while delivering minimal tangible outcomes, and rather than acknowledging this failure and adjusting their approach, they double down on the ownership mentality. They expect our votes. They demand our organizing. dehumanizing. They take our loyalty as a given and get offended when we question what we're getting in return. The 2016 election exposed this perfectly. Hillary Clinton told a radio host that she carries hot sauce in her purse, a painfully transparent attempt at cultural pandering. Her campaign assumed Black voters would turn out because, well, they always do. When turnout dropped slightly compared to Obama years, the response wasn't introspection about what the campaign failed to offer Black voters. It was anger that we didn't perform our expected role. By 2020, the entitlement was explicit. Joe Biden told Charlemagne the God, "If you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you're not Black." Read that again. A white politician told Black people that their political choices determine their racial authenticity. That's not coalition building. That's ownership mentality. That's a plantation boss telling you that if you think about leaving, you were never really part of the family. And here we are in 2024 and heading into 2026, and the script hasn't changed. Democrats still believe they own Black America. They still expect our votes without offering specific policies. They still demand our loyalty while delivering symbolic representation instead of material outcomes. And when we question this arrangement, when we ask what we're getting in return, they respond with three tactics: fear, guilt, and gaslighting. The fear tactic is about Republicans and Trump specifically. They tell us that if we don't vote Democratic, then Trump will destroy democracy, strip our rights, and unleash unprecedented racism. This is psychological manipulation at its finest. They're not selling us on what they'll do for us. They're selling us on fear of what someone else might do to us. That's not a platform. That's hostage negotiation. But here's the reality check they don't want you to process. What exactly are we afraid of? Trump was president for 4 years. What specifically happened to Black America during that time that was worse than what's happened under decades of Democratic control in our major cities? Unemployment was at historic lows for Black Americans pre-pandemic. The First Step Act released thousands of people, many of them Black, from the prison sentences that Biden's 1994 crime bill helped create. I'm not saying Trump is some savior for Black folks, far from it, but the fear campaign doesn't match reality. You know what we should actually fear? Another 40 years of unconditional loyalty that delivers nothing. That's the real threat, not Trump, not Republicans, but our own willingness to accept symbolic gestures instead of tangible outcomes. The guilt tactic is about legacy and identity. They tell us we're betraying the civil rights movement if we don't vote Democratic. They invoke Martin Luther King Jr., even though King was becoming increasingly critical of both parties before he was assassinated. They tell us our ancestors fought for the right to vote, so we're disrespecting them if we don't use that vote for Democrats specifically. This is emotional terrorism disguised as historical consciousness. But our ancestors didn't fight for the right to vote Democrat. They fought for the right to vote, period, which includes the right to vote strategically, to withhold votes when we're being exploited, and to demand specific returns on our political investment. Using our votes strategically honors their sacrifice. Giving it away for free dishonors it. The gaslighting tactic is the most insidious. When we point out that decades of Democratic loyalty has delivered subpar outcomes, they tell us we're being divisive, unrealistic, or secretly working for Republicans. They tell us that progress takes time, even though it's been 60 years. They tell us that we need to focus on the coalition, even though everyone else in the coalition gets to advocate fiercely for their specific interests, while we're expected to sacrifice ours for the greater good. This is classic abuser psychology. When you point out mistreatment, the abuser tells you that you're the problem. You're too demanding. You're not being reasonable. You're imagining things. Meanwhile, the mistreatment continues because you've been manipulated into thinking that expecting better is somehow wrong. Here's where delineation becomes revolutionary. When Black America says, we're not people of color, we're not part of some generic minority coalition, we're Black Americans with a specific history and specific claims that need to be addressed, we're rejecting the framework that allows Democrats to take us for granted. We're establishing that we're a distinct political constituency with distinct needs that require distinct policies. This terrifies them because every other advocacy group operates this way. The Cuban American community in Florida demands and receives specific attention to their concerns about Cuba policy. The Jewish community demands and receives specific attention to their concerns about Israel. Labor unions demand and receive specific policy concessions. Business interests demand and receive specific tax and regulatory considerations. But when Black Americans demand specific policies, specific budgets, and specific outcomes for our specific community, we're told that's divisive and unrealistic. Why the double standard? Because the democratic ownership mentality depends on us accepting less than everyone else while delivering more than everyone else. We're expected to be the foundation of their electoral coalition, the organizers, the ground troops, the reliable votes, while accepting whatever scraps fall from the table after everyone else has eaten. The minority coalition experiment failed Black America because coalitions require shared interests or at least mutual respect for each other's interests. But in practice, what happened is that everyone else's interests got prioritized while ours got perpetually delayed. Immigration reform got pushed, LGBTQ rights got pushed, environmental justice got pushed, and we celebrated all of that because we were told we're all in this together. But when it came time to push Black-specific policies like reparations, anti-Black hate crime legislation, or targeted economic development, suddenly it was too divisive, too expensive, too politically risky. That's not a coalition, that's a hierarchy, and we're at the bottom expected to carry everyone else up while we stay in place. So what's the solution? It's simple in concept, challenging in execution. We adopt the same political strategy that every other successful interest group uses: transactional politics. You want our votes? Here's what we want in return: specific policies, specific budgets, specific timelines. Put it in writing. Deliver it or lose our support. That's how politics works for everyone else. That's how it needs to work for us. The comfortable couch strategy is brilliant psychology. When you tell politicians that you'd rather stay home than vote for someone who offers you nothing, you're establishing that your vote has to be earned, not assumed. You're creating leverage where none existed before. And leverage is power. Democrats will say that's cutting off your nose to spite your face, that you're helping Republicans win. But that's more ownership mentality. They're telling you that you're responsible for their victories, but they're not responsible for earning your support. That's backwards. They're responsible for giving you a reason to support them. If they can't or won't, that's their failure, not yours. Look, I'm not telling anyone to vote Republican. I'm telling you to vote in your own interest, period. If Democrats offer you tangible policies that address your specific needs, evaluate that offer. If Republicans offer you tangible policies that address your specific needs, evaluate that offer. If neither offers you anything specific, then evaluate whether participating in that particular election serves your interests at all. That's strategic thinking. That's self-respect. That's freedom. We belong to no one but God and our community. That statement is spiritually and politically profound. Spiritually, it reminds us that our worth isn't determined by political parties or validation from systems that exploited us. Politically, it establishes that our loyalty is to outcomes for our community, not to institutions that take us for granted. The Trump fear campaign is particularly insulting because it assumes we're too unsophisticated to evaluate threat levels rationally. They want us to believe that Trump represents some unique danger that requires us to abandon our own interests and support Democrats unconditionally. But we've survived worse than Trump. We survived actual slavery. We survived Jim Crow. We survived lynching, redlining, mass incarceration, and economic devastation. We'll survive whatever Trump does or doesn't do. What we might not survive is another generation of political exploitation disguised as partnership. That's the real existential threat. Becoming so comfortable with symbolic representation and empty promises that we forget to demand actual progress. Democrats feel they own Black America because we've acted like we're owned. We've accepted their framework, their priorities, their excuses. But ownership is a state of mind before it's a state of affairs. The moment we start thinking and acting like free political agents who can take our support anywhere or withhold it entirely, the ownership illusion collapses. They need us infinitely more than we need them. Without Black voters, Democrats lose elections across the country. They know this. We know this. The only question is whether we'll leverage that knowledge into tangible outcomes or continue accepting symbolic gestures and fear campaigns. The answer determines whether we're political partners or political property, and I know which one our ancestors fought for us to be.